So we as a panel will do our best. We've got a great panel, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves. We've got Jimmy Goodrich from the Semiconductor Industry Association, John Huang from EY Taiwan, and Neil Thomas from MacroPolo at the Hodson Institute. So Jimmy, you're on the left-hand side of my list up there. Why don't you kick us off with a little intro?
Sure. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Jimmy Goodrich with the Semiconductor Industry Association. I'm the Vice President for Global Policy. I lead all of our Asia, international, China, and trade and technology work. So been pretty busy, as you can imagine, as the semiconductor industry, whether we like it or not, has been the center of a lot of the geopolitics today. So glad to be here with my fellow panelists and look forward to the discussion.
John, you're next on my little view. Why don't you go for it?
Okay, my name is John Huang. I'm based in Taiwan. I've been focusing on high-tech industry and also within semiconductor. And I'm luckily very close to the semiconductor industry in Taiwan. And in late 90s, started with TSMC with one of my first clients. And so I've been focusing business consulting industry and also in supply chain management. So that's my role.
Great.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, John. And Neil.
Yeah, hi, I'm Neil Thomas. I'm a Senior Research Associate at MacroPolo, which is the in-house think tank of the Hodson Institute in Chicago. Our mission is to decode China's arrival across economics, politics, and technology. And to that end, earlier this year, we launched a product called Supply Chain Jigsaw, which focused on a number of emerging key inputs into the digital economy, one of which being AI chips.
Great, thanks very much, Neil. Okay, so we've got some different angles from all three of you. Jimmy is currently winning the Zoom backdrop competition with his semiconductors. I want to start us off with a question for all or one or some of you to answer. With the title of the panel is Semiconductors: The Lifeblood of the 21st Century Economy. First of all, do you agree with that? You guys didn't come up with that question. Is that true? And if it's true, then how are they the lifeblood? Please describe to us in what way they are the lifeblood of the 21st century economy. Whoever wants to grab it, go for it.
I'm happy to take that one if you'd like. If I don't know the answer to that, I'd be having difficulty in my job. I think as we think about it, the integrated circuit, which was invented in the 1940s and 50s, which led to the semiconductor, really is the foundation for almost everything digital that we know today. So everyone who uses phones, laptops, browses the web, everything at some point touches across hardware that runs on semiconductors or the silicon chips inside that hardware that powers, processes the data, stores the data, or helps you translate the physical to the digital world. And semiconductors are just broader than your just computing infrastructure or your laptop or your PC, and they include everything from, for example, now the radars in cars that help them drive autonomously, that's a semiconductor. The battery that powers your electric vehicle, that's managed by a semiconductor. Even inside satellites that look at weather patterns and formations, the image sensors are based off of semiconductor technology that communicate back down to the ground with semiconductors. So virtually everything digital in the economy today touches upon a semiconductor device. And then while we're looking at new computing paradigms like quantum computing, I think those are still several decades away from actual mass commercial adoption. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to have a very silicon and semiconductor-based digital future. And that's incredibly important because, as the panel talks about, it's relying upon probably one of the deepest and most globalized supply chains, period. So I think that answers your question. I agree, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Closer to the truth, sorry.
Closer to the truth. Yes. That was the thrust of your argument, I believe. John or Neil, do you have a different angle on this question? I mean, Jimmy gave us a fairly comprehensive one. I mean, the other side of this is, how is it the lifeblood? It's kind of all about managing data flows at the end of the day, right? And unlocking value, tapping into data where you weren't able to do it before. What do you think?
Yeah, this is John. I'd like to add a little bit. I think what semiconductor did was actually make the computation that's accessible to the consumer. So it takes this technology and sort of spread it out to the consumer technology. And with all the mobility and all that, and it has become taking this computational power and to be able to spread into the consumer. And now that really changes all the consumer life and how the world moves forward. So definitely it becomes a lifeblood. It's more so than, you know, consumer products nowadays.
Right. Neil, do you want to add?
Yeah, just quickly, from the artificial intelligence angle. So progress in AI is dependent on, I mean, three major pillars: data, algorithms, and computing power. And there's been a lot of attention about data, how China has a lot of data, for instance, different data regulations. There's been a lot written about algorithms and the various competitions between firms to, you know, push the boundaries on that. But I really like to get better AI, what we really need is better computing power. And that's where semiconductors really come in as the lifeblood of the AI economy and of, you know, future innovations in that space.
Okay, so the panel broadly agrees that the premise of the panel is correct. So that's helpful. That's good. Given that, I mean, you know, I think we're going to spend most of our time talking about the lines that are being drawn between the US and China right at the moment. And, you know, we have a lot of new, you know, we could spend the whole panel just talking about the last week probably. Would each of you give me just sort of something from your last few weeks that you have noted that is defining how the ecosystem is moving and shifting in response to the politics? Could be a big thing, could be a small thing, just something that you've noted that that our viewers would be interested in. And just before you do, by the way, to the viewers, do just type in any questions you've got right into the Q&A as we go, as you think of them, and I'll come to them whenever. I'll come to them if we all get bored and have a lull, or I'll come to them right at the end. So yeah, just to prompt you guys to put in your questions as we go. Jimmy, what do you think?
Well, I think undeniably we're seeing the, you know, new geopolitical lines being drawn inside the semiconductor industry. But at the same time, it's also mashing up against the laws of technology and also the economics of global supply chains. And I think that tension is something that it's not new and surprising, but I think it's probably the most notable trend that we're seeing in the semiconductor industry today. Whether it's China that's seeking to develop its own semiconductor capability, which inherently is not on its own a negative thing, but rather the tactics and methods have been something that's raised concern globally, or whether it's the United States that's even now recognizing that for too long it's let most of the manufacturing grow overseas as opposed to the United States. And so I think maybe surprisingly in the United States now, you saw the US Senate and the US House of Representatives agree upon bipartisan legislation that would help incentivize new semiconductor supply chains here in the US through government grants and R&D and other forms of tax credits to help spur semiconductor manufacturing here. So we're almost seeing it go full cycle. First, 5 years ago, it was China that through its Made in China 2025 plan, well, actually 1 year earlier in 2014 with its IC plan, so that they wanted to double down and rebalance supply chains into their country. Now we see the United States saying, well, hold on here. We want to maintain our strategic leadership in this technology, and part of that includes manufacturing. And so for companies who have global supply chains, like every semiconductor company does, you have to deal with these competing priorities by different capitals.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. Sorry about that. One of the things that an investor said to me recently that I hadn't fully appreciated, although of course it is just obvious, is that if you want to invest in semiconductors on planet Earth, why would you do it anywhere except where the biggest subsidies are, right? And so in a way, it's a shame we don't have a money person on this panel because, and I'm certainly not one, but one of my big questions is, can America financialize in the same way that China is trying to do? Is America even capable of competing on that playing field? You could make arguments about America having a more efficient model to pour the money into. I mean, I don't know if maybe John, I don't know if that's one for you, if that you have thoughts on from Ernst & Young, but I don't know the answer to that question, and it seems an important one to me that has nothing to do with chips in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and there's some very late development regarding to Wuhan. Actually, interestingly, the supposed start of the virus pandemic. There's a semiconductor company, HSMC, is running into financial problem, right? So you were talking about pumping a lot of money into the semiconductor industry, and definitely, for the past few years, China has, empowering more of the state-owned enterprises, and sort of they call it the moving in of the state-owned, and then the moving out of the private sector, and certainly that's going to be what's happening within the semiconductor industry, and I think for the rest of the world outside of China, there's still going to be a lot of opportunity for people to invest in semiconductors. And as people who follows the equity market, TSMC has been enjoying a lot of premium these days. And also, I think with this movement, I think with the United States and also the Taiwan semiconductor industry seems to be a perfect match, because the foundry and the assembly sector are mostly based from Taiwan, but the upfront, the design, the EDA, the software is mostly the market share is US, and that sort of complete the whole value chain. And I think China is we have to see, and with this the downfall of HSMC, also in the early days the Taiwan talents that got poached moving into China, now you have start to see some reversal of that flow. So I think that's going to be one of the very important factors in how China would continue with that industry.
Right.
That if you'd like.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so we actually have a study that's going to be released next week that compares fab economics across the world, and trying to look at what the cost difference actually is between the US and the rest of the world. I can give a little bit of a sneak preview. I think, and we did this by studying the types of fabs, memory, analog, logic, and then the types of incentives, cost, and labor benefits that are available around the world. Overall, the United States comes out about 20 to 30% higher in terms of costs of operating a fab over 10 years. So that's building and operating a fab, than everywhere except China. China is nearly 50% less expensive than the US, or the US is 50% more, sorry. And that's primarily due to government incentives. So if you look at fab construction over the last couple of decades, there really has never been a big fab that has been built without government incentives. In fact, the OECD did a very excellent and very detailed 100-page report last year that surveyed subsidies in the semiconductor industry amongst the top 20 semiconductor producers. It found that there were tens of billions of government incentives given out from countries like Israel, Ireland, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea. But the percentage of subsidization to revenue in China was from 30 to 50% of a company's revenue. So the subsidies in effect created the firm and allowed the firm to operate in the market. Whereas subsidies to multinational companies like Samsung or SK Hynix or Toshiba were a fraction, so only single-digit percentage of their overall revenue. So these were essentially incentives that tipped the scale just slightly to ensure that the factory that was going to be built anyways gets built in their country. And what the United States is hoping to do through legislation, proposed $20 billion in a semiconductor grant manufacturing program, is not create new fabs that would not have been built otherwise, but simply just tilt the scale so that things slide from the table over from perhaps Singapore or parts of Europe to the United States, equalize the US with the other countries that are investing to make their semiconductor regions competitive. I don't think the United States really has the belief that it could compete or should compete with China's economic model. When you have the state that owns 100% of the firm, decides market outcomes, you have a local mayor who says, I want to build a fab, you know what, I'm going to do $5 billion in capacity, and just makes it up out of thin air, gets a high political marks on his internal cadre grading system, but the fab oftentimes is not run efficiently, doesn't hit market targets because there are none. And then now we're seeing more of these fabs like HSMC, others like Tower Jazz, Tacoma Semiconductor, and Nanjing go boom and bankrupt. On the other side, though, there are other fabs in China that are coming up very quickly and have a more, I'd say, a higher chance of success, like in the flash memory space or mature logic foundry. So China is a big country. It's a country of many different stories. Almost every province has a different story. So you can find both success and failure there.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to TSMC and just to you quickly-ish, John, which is my understanding is that TSMC has been at least thinking about building a fab in the United States for quite a long time, sort of on and off, and it never really panned out for various reasons. Can you give us some thoughts on why this time from the Taiwanese side? I think from the American side, it's clearer, because politically that they wanted it. But from the Taiwanese side, why does it suit that? Why does it suit TSMC and the Taiwanese now?
Well, of course, I think the biggest driver is on the U.S. side. They were encouraged the State Department to do so, and then also for strategic reasons. And it's believed that a lot of the defense sector semiconductor will get built by the new fab. But from Taiwan also, there's when I mentioned about the talents, the people, just within the past, I think a week, TSMC is announcing they want to hire 7,000 to 8,000 people and engineers. And one of the talent pool is definitely United States. And that's also been believed that that's one of the reasons why TSMC want to go to US, is to access the more of the international talents in the semiconductor. And that's what in Arizona, there's Intel is also there.
Yeah. The talents thing is clearly very important. And one of the things I've been hearing in the last few weeks is that a lot of the talent at HiSilicon, which is a fabless, obviously not actually making the chips themselves, but a lot of that talent is basically leaving and going to Chinese mainland competitors. One of the big things I wanted to talk about was, to what extent you all think that the problems that Huawei faces, to put it mildly, are going to, I don't really want to hear about Huawei exactly. I want to hear about the impact of the challenges it faces, but, things like engineers leaving, that will have on the rest of the Chinese market and on the broader discussion that we're talking about. Again, would love to hear more on that from any of you. Like John, for instance, have you seen, are you hearing about, do mainland HiSilicon engineers come to Taiwan? Is that a thing that happens?
Well, I don't think that would be the case, but there are some Taiwan-based engineers that's thinking about coming back to Taiwan. I mean, originally, of course, they have this big dream of a big market in China, and especially HSMC's head came from ex-TSMC and brought a few hundred engineers over there. And now that company go bust, and these engineers need to find somewhere to go. So definitely that's that potential flow of talents. And I think what would be interesting is China is still, I still believe, this is going to slow down China, maybe 5-10 years, but still, it's a big country and still had a good base of economy. So, who can tell after 10 years they might be on the way of a rebound and come back.
Yeah,
I think just to add on that, China is a huge market for U.S. semiconductor companies, but it's oftentimes China's thought of as the electronics factory of the world. So I think there's a misperception that most U.S. semiconductors are actually produced there. In fact, we've looked at the data pretty in a very detailed manner. Less than 5% of U.S. production happens in China. That includes actual production by vertically integrated firms and companies that might produce with foundries like SMIC or Huali. So it's a tiny fraction of American chips that are actually manufactured there, and then the majority of American chips are actually still researched and designed. All the design work is done in the United States. There is about 10 to 20% of the back end assembly test that happens in China, but that's about 10% of the value add of a chip. So the value really is in the research, the development, the chip design, the front end production, where China has the largest share of US semiconductor chip production is in that assembly test. And overall, there's actually still more US assembly tests that happens outside than inside of China. Majority of that being in Southeast Asia. So, but what China is important for US companies is the market. It's 36% of US semiconductor revenue. And so whether it be Huawei or Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, Gree air conditioner, Neo car, it just goes on and on and on. The growth for a lot of US semiconductor companies, any global semiconductor company, really is in China. And so I think, one company down, one company up, it's not going to change the trend line of 1.3 billion people buying a lot of electronic stuff. We just talked about everything that's digital. And what is, I think, a good thing is some policymakers in the US are starting to realize that revenue is critical for American innovation, because US semiconductor companies invest 1/5 of their revenue into research development. It's the highest ratio of any other semiconductor industry in the world by a huge margin. That's how US companies stay ahead. And so the US and China are joined at the hip. China needs its digital infrastructure. We need to be able to invest in R&D. And it's this odd but essential relationship that keeps both countries' economies running.
Yeah. Neil, do come in on that.
I'll just add, building on Jimmy's and John's excellent comments. I mean, in terms of where the US and other countries could make a difference for China's semiconductor industry, I think that really comes into the potential for China to build its own chips, right? Particularly at the cutting edge, and that's where we're seeing in recent days there's been reports of the Trump administration considering an export ban or export licensing system on SMIC, China's biggest and most advanced chip producer. And I think there's also real potential, especially if there's a change in administration in November, for some kind of multilateral export control regime when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, which could potentially have quite a far-reaching impact upon China's ability to make not just the kind of 5 nanometer transistors that are at the cutting edge right now, but depending on how extensive those controls are, whether they don't just cover extreme ultraviolet photolithography, but also argon fluoride, which is the 7 to 45 nanometer range, that could potentially be a spanner in the works of China's domestic fabs.
Yeah, a friend said to me the other day that the difference between what a Biden administration and the current administration might do is the difference between like blasting great big holes in a thing that you're trying to change in the way that you want versus like putting a net around it. And I agree that potentially a Biden administration, just through being multilateral, might actually constrain the Chinese ecosystem in sort of much more severely than what the current administration is doing through the unilateral stuff that it's focusing on. One other nice comment I wanted to add is a friend of mine, Dan Huang, he describes the Chinese market as inviolable, which I think is exactly what it is, right? You just can't do anything about it. It's the only thing that America can't really do anything about. They cannot export control the market power away. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. I want to come back to you, Neil, to talk about AI chips, because I know you've been doing some work on this recently. Kind of pitch us AI chips, right? I mean, China buys whatever it is, $400 billion of chips a year. The global market for AI chips at the moment is, I don't know, you tell me, in the double-digit billions, maybe just. It's pretty small, right? So show us that exponential Masayoshi-san curve and explain why this is a big deal.
Sure. Yeah. Well, AI chips are really just semiconductors that are used to support AI applications. Image recognition, natural language processing, autonomous vehicles, whatever it might be. And needless to say, given how important we all know AI is going to be for the future of not just business and technology, but also military and strategic applications, so being able to manufacture these chips is going to become a serious geopolitical advantage. And AI chips will also, gradually become a much bigger business. I think the forecast is there are going to be anything up to 20% of the total semiconductor market by 2025, something to the tune of 65 to 85 billion dollars, depending on whose estimates you believe. So a much higher CAGR than we see for the overall semiconductor market. And as I mentioned before, AI chips need to be very powerful. So you see the AI chips kind of operating much closer on average to the cutting edge, this kind of 15 to 16 nanometer transistor range than the overall semiconductor market as well. And that kind of amount of computing power that's required to train the best AI algorithms has been increasing exponentially over the last few years. A potential reason why this could be, the emergence of AI chips could be a boon for China's industry is that we're seeing increasing customization of chips for specific AI purposes. So one example being a move towards application-specific integrated circuits, ASICs. And this kind of lean towards customized designs for AI chips, kind of perceived as giving upstarts and newcomers, like in China, a chance to be more competitive than they were in existing segments. And we saw many Chinese firms like Huawei with the Kirin 980 or Alibaba with the Hangguang 800 designing some really good AI chips. But the problem being that they can't make those chips yet. It's the same issue that the broader Chinese semiconductor industry faces in this increasingly geopolitical and increasingly kind of risky supply chain environment.
Jimmy, can I come to you to kind of add to that? I'm going to unfairly pigeonhole you here as the air conditioner chip guy, and like boring chips, right? They're everywhere. So, what's your thoughts on what Neil has just told us? Do you agree with the sort of the view that the sort of ASICs and ML optimized chips are becoming increasingly important at a rate that is important for the viewers of this panel to pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, well, so if you look at future demand drivers in the semiconductor industry, there's a couple sort of huge transformations that are happening. One is artificial intelligence. The other is cloud computing, Internet of Things, electrification. All of these are critically and very important for future semiconductor growth, because you're going to create new applications that will require all new types of semiconductors. But at the same time, if you're creating, for example, a new AI system that helps you sort packages for automated delivery, that doesn't just require your new AI chips that go into the cloud to do things like inferencing, to be able to recognize the package types or where they need to go, but also down to the sensors that are in the sorting facility, the little camera that might be on your delivery person's car, or the GPS sensor that helps geofence that you've dropped off the package in the right location. Those chips aren't new. They've been around for a while. So AI itself, the AI chip market is expected to be around 30 to 40 billion of total addressable semiconductor market by 2023. That's going to be a roughly $500-600 billion market. But it's going to drive a lot of other growth, because every time you need a new AI processor, you're going to need more memory, more sensors, more communications power. And so this is all sort of interrelated. It drives 5G growth as well, because you need higher latency to do more AI applications. But the sort of sexy AI in the data center gets all the attention. The Google Tensor Processing Unit, huge NVIDIA, Tesla GPUs, but actually increasingly a lot more of the AI is being done at the edge. And the edge, for example, that's going to be your Amazon Alexa or your smart garage door opener. And what you're going to start to see are more lower power, but highly efficient sensors that have some of the image processing and recognition capability built into that chip. And you're starting to see that one of the most interesting things right now is a technology called neuromorphic computing. Neuromorphic computing mimics the brain. The brain is the most efficient computer on the face of the planet. It consumes so little power, but does so much. And that's the attempt of the semiconductor industry, is to try and mimic the brain. And IBM and a couple of companies have already started to do that, because then you can do really fast AI algorithms in things like a drone that require to be up in the air for a long time with minimal battery power. You can't just put a Intel or NVIDIA processor in your drone or your car and expect the battery not to run out pretty quickly. So that's, AI is all over the place. It's edge, it's core, it's old and new technology.
Thanks, Jimmy. I want to come back to you, John, and I want to talk about TSMC. My colleagues and friends know that I'm a little bit obsessed with TSMC as a company. And when I last wrote a big piece about the company in sort of November last year, I think it was the 30th most valuable company on earth. Now it's in the top 10. So, I mean, that's just share prices, right? But that's still quite dramatic. So I get sent all these articles all the time, and one of the ones I got sent was this article making an analogy between Taiwan and Arrakis in Dune. And Arrakis is a planet in this science fiction novel by Frank Herbert, on which there is a substance called spice that allows you to like see time and do very clever things, and the whole galaxy is run on this stuff. And the comparison that was made is that in the novel, the line is, he who controls the spice controls the galaxy. And the end of this article said something along the lines of, they who control the chips control the world. I wanted to ask you, I mean, that's obviously slightly silly, right? But it prompts an interesting question for me, which is how aware is the domestic politics in Taiwan of the power that it holds in having TSMC's most advanced cutting edge node fabs on their soil? Is that part of the domestic political discussion at all? How much attention are people paying to this company domestically?
Yeah. Actually, Taiwan is very aware of TSMC's power. They actually call it the Protector of Taiwan recently, because this side of the Pacific, actually, China has been conducting a lot of military exercise surrounding the island, and it has been quite tense. And you see the U.S. 7th Fleet with all the dual aircraft carrier roaming around here, and I think the only probably one of the reasons is because TSMC is still in Taiwan. If you bomb out Taiwan, that's going to put a halt to the electronic supply chain. So we're glad that we still have a TSMC here to keep us safe. But also in a way, I think TSMC has been with the Moore's been trying to keep up with the Moore's law and try to push the process technology. And I think that's what's accelerating the development with the AI, with the latest technology that they're able to enable it in a way. So that definitely, I think and Taiwan is very very serious, and also we give a lot of you spoke about subsidy. Well, of course they get a lot of tax break, but I think there's even more industry that's building surrounding TSMC. TSMC is also helping develop the equipment ecosystem for Taiwan, and because obviously there's a lot of reliance on the ASML on European and US, and so we're also trying to build up that ecosystem on our own.
I do want to talk about tooling in just a second, but Neil or Jimmy, do you have any thoughts on the ridiculousness of that metaphor, or on? I mean, maybe I'm thinking about the sort of geopolitical heft of TSMC in slightly the wrong light. So I'd love to hear how. Go for it, Jimmy. Go, Jimmy. You opened your mouth first.
Okay. Yes, TSMC is an amazing success story. There are a lot of amazing success stories in the semiconductor industry. I think if there's one thing that the US could possibly learn from Taiwan is that, if you look at the way TSMC was grown, it came out of a industrial research institute called ITRI, a spinoff of a government R&D initiative. So you had government investment into basic research and development. And then the Taiwanese government was very pro-growth for high technology. From the mid-1990s to roughly 2010, Taiwan had a very aggressive investment tax credit that in total roughly turned out to about $15 to $25 billion in a government incentive for semiconductor manufacturing. And that time period is when you saw major Taiwanese companies growing extremely fast in the market. So you had a very pro-growth government that wanted to have the manufacturing there. And I think that's a lesson learned for the United States, for other countries, that if you want that chip manufacturing, you have to make the investments to make it attractive for countries to do that. Just one final point, I think, is that we're starting to see the technology become more and more difficult. And TSMC has been on a great success ride. Other companies are doing interesting innovations. Samsung, for example, is looking at something called gate-all-around technology for 5 and 3 nanometer, heavily using EUV. Intel, I wouldn't count them out. They invented the integrated circuit, the industry, the microprocessor. So I think there's still a lot riding for them, and they still have incredible innovation. So let's not forget that, there are other companies out there that make this a highly competitive market. It's that competition that drives the innovation.
I think oh, sorry, go Neil.
So I'll be really quick there. I was just going to add, building on Jimmy's point, that I think there is increasing concern in the American geopolitical community, if you like, the foreign policy community in DC, that there is perhaps too much of America's semiconductor supply chain in Taiwan. We obviously all know that Beijing considers Taiwan to be a renegade province, and there's even some corners of that strategic world in Washington that kind of seriously think it's a possibility that Xi Jinping could use force to act against Taiwan if his supply of semiconductors is cut off by the Trump administration. I think it's probably taking it a little bit too far. There's been less change in rhetoric than is often been thought in terms of how Beijing talks about Taiwan under Xi Jinping. But still, I think that's another motivator towards more support from the American government, from other Western governments, for fostering resiliency in their own supply chains and to building up more capacity outside of Taiwan.
I've always thought I'd be very curious to know how many actual conversations about semiconductors she has. I don't know, that's a little food for thought. I'm going to take one of the questions because it fits with this. It's from one anonymous attendee, and we've got one more question there. It's also very good on STEM and talent flows into the US. So anyone watching, you got some more questions, do ping them in. So anonymous attendee asks, I'd be interested to hear how intellectual property protections would factor into decisions on locating semiconductor production facilities. With China's history of forced tech transfer and outright IP theft, how does that impact the decision-making calculus to include those non-financial / hard to quantify values? And the reason I tie this to the TSMC discussion is that TSMC is almost like sort of competitive edge is in the protection of IP and particularly of trade secrets, right? It's almost like a machine built to keep secrets in the building. And I've heard stories about like their Nanjing fab is lights out and no humans are allowed in it. And that's why they were able to build it in mainland China, this kind of thing. So I would love to hear any of your thoughts on this question about, the semiconductor world in China re-IP. Who wants to go first? I see some nodding and smiling. I don't.
Well, I'll go first. I think you're right, because I worked in TSMC fab in late 90s, and then it was already everywhere. The IP protection, the secrecy is embedded in the culture. So just one thing, food for thought is, what if China, throw in the tower and say, okay, we give up and we just focus on the lower tech of semiconductors, and I think that's a possibility. If you look at how Japan and US had the semiconductor agreement, Japan used to have a lot of semiconductor industry, but now they don't. They just focus on other technologies. What if China says, okay, we're going to respect the IP, and then we're gonna, get the foundation and use our, cost advantages, and we just make the consumer grade semicon, and then, let's do that for 10 years and have a trade deal with the US in this regard. And I think maybe that will be interesting. It may be good to hear something from Jimmy on this also?
Yeah, I mean, so in the study that we're going to release next week, actually, we surveyed semiconductor executives on what are the primary factors that lead to decision making for where to site a fab. And intellectual property protection is one of the key factors. I mean, the biggest, not surprisingly, is supply chain. So the upstream supplier ecosystem and costs and labor. But intellectual property is also, and the protection of it is a key issue. And most of the IP in the semiconductor industry, particularly in manufacturing, tends to be in trade secrets, because you don't want to patent your manufacturing process for others to see and copy. So where do trade secrets hit? Well, they sit up here in people's brains. In fact, one CTO of a major semiconductor company explained it to me as kind of tribal knowledge that's passed down from generation to generation, and the one tribe can't talk to the other because they're using a completely different language. I think that's kind of a fitting sort of explanation of how important the IP and the trade secrets is in the semiconductor industry. And so it really comes down to your trust in your employees and trust in the environment. I think China has made, there's no doubt, improvement in its intellectual property system. They now have specialized IP courts for things like integrated circuits patent disputes and trade secrets issues. But at the same time, there's also major discrepancies where it appears this, states favoring local champions over foreign investors. But increasingly, we see actually Chinese companies using the system to defend their own IP against other Chinese companies. And we see a number of cases like that across China. But I think, facts speak hard truth, and so do the data. And the data shows that the vast majority of multinational companies choose to not locate their manufacturing facilities in China. There's a few exceptions to that. About a quarter of the world's memory production happens in China through SK Hynix and Samsung fabs in China. But I've been to both, and it's like little Korea towns. As you mentioned, kind of very self-sufficient, high degree of expatriate workers, but in addition, the technology sometimes tends to be a generation or two behind what's the leading edge in Korea. And actually, the Korean government requires that. The Korean government requires that IP transfer to China for semiconductor production undergo review by their trade ministry. Taiwan requires that as well. There's an N-1 regulation that says if you want to build a factory in Taiwan, not only do you have to get government approval, you have to have one existing fab already in Taiwan, and it has to be a generation behind what you have there. So we see a high degree of caution by the governments.
Can I just very quickly ask you, Jimmy, given that it's just a bunch of Koreans in a sort of walled town in the middle of China at these memory fabs that are generating—
That's a bit of an exaggeration. It's not entirely that, but yeah.
Well, so what I was going to ask you is why? Why do they even go to China at all? They're not getting cheaper labor, presumably. It's probably even more expensive to get Koreans to move to China. Like, why do they go, and why does China want them?
I think one of the big factors is—
just before you answer though, Jimmy, quickly if you can, because we've got 15 minutes left and we've opened up a seam of pretty good questions, so I'd like to get to some of them.
Yeah. Just really quickly, the market. So I want to be close to their customers. Second, supply chain diversification. Almost the entirety of Korean production is front-loaded in South Korea, and so they need a little bit of geographic dispersion. It's a quick 1.5 hour hop from Seoul to Xi'an or to Wuxi. So it just makes sense from business perspective. And the government was very welcoming of that investment and still continues to be.
Cool. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and go into like rapid, concise question answering mode, because we've got probably more than we'll get through. Do keep them coming, and I'll pick the best ones. This is probably another one for you, Jimmy. I'm sorry you're getting a workout here. John Mandeville, hi John, asks about ATM in Southeast Asia was mentioned in passing. He says, is there any evidence that these countries are going up the value chain towards R&D and fabs? And we're basically, let's just step back from US, China, Taiwan, and talk about other Southeast Asian countries for a second.
Well, I think it's already moving up the value chain for a lot of these countries. You see Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, very prevalent in the semiconductor assembly test market. Singapore is a great story where, they had Chartered Semiconductor, that was a Singaporean company merged with IBM and then Global Foundries. But there's a lot of actual wafer production that happens in Singapore, and that's because of a very aggressive government investment. You even see India, particularly in the fabless startup space, becoming more innovative. So I think there is opportunity because you're seeing more of the electronics OEM supply chain move part of their production out of China. And with that, it's going to be opportunities for those countries to move up. But it's not going to be easy. Assembling a flat panel display is not the same as building a semiconductor.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if you other guys have a comment on that. It seems like a specific Jimmy question. So unless you do, just interrupt me, but we will move on. Let's go to, there's a question from Clarice Brown that is an interesting one, maybe one for Neil and John, well, for all three of you really. But she asks, how does intensifying US government scrutiny of STEM researchers and students, including visa uncertainty, crackdown on H-1Bs, how does that affect TSMC's decision-making calculus? Maybe let's start with you, John. I think you'll have some thoughts on that and then come to whoever.
I didn't quite get the calculus.
Oh, the question is the U.S. government is restricting a lot of STEM visas and sort of cracking down on students, particularly mainland Chinese students. Do you think that plays into the TSMC calculus at all?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Neil, do you want to add to the affirmative there?
Yeah, again, I mean, the calculus for TSMC, I'm a little less certain on, but I think, I mean, the major effect, right, of these increased restrictions and scrutiny, especially on mainland Chinese students and workers in STEM, I mean, what's going to happen is that those people aren't going to work in the United States. They're going to work in potentially other Western countries, but perhaps more likely China. So we've actually done some research, not on semiconductors as such, but on artificial intelligence and flows of talent. And I mean, China's the largest source of top-tier researchers for AI in the world. But the majority of these, I think 56%, they go on to study and work and live and contribute to the United States. And sure, there's a small increased risk of espionage, but companies are wise to this, and as we've discussed, there are a lot of precautions in place. So I think, if anything, it's a boon to the Chinese domestic semiconductor industry to have it more difficult for top semiconductor talent to work in the United States.
I think talent, is super critical. Without it, we cannot design or run our fabs. And if you look at the STEM graduates in electrical engineering in the United States, more than 50% are foreign-born. So you have a supply issue in the United States where American-born students simply are less interested in STEM degrees than they were previously. And when they do get a STEM degree, your material science, chemistry, or even electrical engineering student, they go work for Amazon and Google because it's more interesting, in their opinion, than it is to work in a fab and do hard science. So that's just a basic issue. When you've got that supply deficiency in the US, we need to be able to meet those open job requirements with talented people from overseas. And Chinese make up immigrants a huge portion of that student population. They're incredibly brilliant, and the vast majority want to continue to work here. And America and its innovation benefits from that. At the same time, it's obvious there needs to be more resources to the U.S. government to step up things like visa application scrutiny and counterintelligence resources. But hopefully that can be done in a targeted, narrow way that doesn't, leave an appetite in every student's mouth that they're not welcome here.
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy, you just inadvertently answered a question by David Gossick, which was about this exact issue. Does the US have the engineering workforce to support this potential domestic expansion? Sounds like the answer is no. He does ask what percentage of the workforce is imported at the moment. I don't know if you happen to have that number on the top of your head, do you?
Well, the United States semiconductor industry directly employs roughly 250,000 workers in the United States. Those are, either they're all going to be U.S. citizens from a census perspective. But we enable another 1 million jobs, whether it's in construction or software or materials and equipment. So but that's a small footprint of the overall U.S. workforce, but it's what we enable. The data, though, for college graduates, for graduate degrees, I think it's roughly 60% of electrical engineering graduates are foreign-born.
Wow. Okay.
Master's and PhD level, and
that definitely says something.
Correct.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Jimmy always has the numbers on the top of his head. Let's go. I'm trying to be fast, so forgive me for sort of pushing us along. Tim Stratford asks, how can industry prepare for possible further decoupling initiatives pushed by the USG and or PRC governments? And in answering this, let's initially focus on tooling. Because I'm specifically interested in the Chinese tooling industry, because that's been shown to be a massive weakness that, like, Huawei, for instance, and SMIC are just not ready for. So just sort of the answer to that general question of what to do to prepare for decoupling, but with an initial focus on tooling, if we could. Whoever wants to go. Nobody wants to go, maybe. No, if nobody wants to talk about tooling, that's fine. I mean, I can try and answer that one. Or no, let's ignore tooling and let's answer that question in general. What can the industry in general do to prepare for decoupling initiatives? Are investment flows moving around? I mean, one of the phenomenons that I've reported on is that money that maybe might have been flowing into US companies is now thinking about, well, maybe I don't want to do that if we're going to be in this unilateral export control regime. Maybe I need to think about other options. You know, what else can industry do? This may again be one for you, Jimmy. I don't know. I'm sorry to keep coming to you.
Hoping somebody else fields a question here.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think from a global industry perspective, I mean, what we need to be doing is having more communication and dialogue. We actually have something called the World Semiconductor Council, which includes China, Japan, Taiwan, Europe, the United States, South Korea. We all get together once a year and kind of think about how do we keep this, you know, value chain, this important part of the economy open and running. That, I think, is going to be increasingly important as we see these geopolitical tensions continue. You know, second is, you know, at the end of the day, you know, companies still need to focus on innovation and technology. And, you know, we want to make sure that that's where we keep the eye on the ball, is on innovation, research, and development. Because at the end of the day, you know, whether it's China or another country, the key to staying ahead is to run faster. And if you're stuck all day long thinking about how do you slow down your competitor and not run faster, that's an inefficient way of winning. And oftentimes it doesn't work. And so, you know, we think the key for, you know, responding to, you know, a competition between the US and China is simply for the US to invest in research development, grow its workforce, create new incentives for manufacturing to happen here in the United States, invest in new technologies for securing the supply chain. Certainly it's not going to be a free lunch, but nothing is. So, you know, we need to get ready for that competition with investments. And if you look at the overall amount the U.S. invested into, you know, fighting wars, funding the defense budget, you're over $1 trillion a year. And, you know, $5 to $20, $30 billion can go a long way to ensuring the U.S. maintains its leadership in this position for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so slightly, the answer there was slightly industry can ask government to help them out, but that's fair enough. I think those are good points. John or Neil, do jump in if you have a point to make on that. I'm going to press on again. If there's any more questions from the audience, do ask them now. This is probably the last chance. I'll just take the final one off.
Yeah, oh. The decoupling, I'll just quickly add, for Taiwan, we have seen a big influx of capital leaving China in the upper of $30 billion. And Taiwan has been given tax break, you know, no questions asked, you know, because Taiwan has invested a lot of money in China and did not pay taxes in Taiwan. But it's a huge break for them to do it. And we have seen resounding, you know, response to that. And also another signal is that, you know, the whole electronics chain, even with the contract manufacturing, has been reluctant to go to India, but they're doing it this year. And so everybody is all committed to do that. So I think we'll see even more. And I think definitely the semiconductor, probably the back end, the packaging may go first. So that's kind of my little add.
India will be a really interesting story. Neil, go for it.
I just add really quickly that I think, I mean, this question's a little bit difficult to answer because going back to the very start of the panel, I mean, the semiconductor supply chain is so complex and so interconnected that, I mean, it is really hard to kind of think through the possibilities of what would happen if there was a complete decoupling.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, even the people making the export control rules are kind of only just starting to get to grips with how complex the whole thing is. I'm going to answer Adam Barbina's question myself, just in the name of completeness. Panelists, correct me if I am wrong, which I may be. Adam asks whether, given everything we've discussed, do we foresee the M&A landscape in semiconductor and adjacent sectors going forward? Do we continue to see tech M&A between China and the US? I'm going to say not really, especially Chinese M&A inbound into the US. That's basically dead. No one is even bothering to ask CFIUS if they can buy American things anymore. US money going into China, yes, I think, but in specific sectors. I'm sure there's some US money going into semiconductors, but I imagine that's been tamped down. I mean, if there's anything to add, do just jump in, but otherwise we will move to a closing thought. This is a little bit of a curveball, but I wanted to ask, given that we're talking about the lifeblood of the 21st century and these comparisons with oil and oil infrastructure and chips, oil has had these huge externalities of climate change, right? Burning fossil fuels has created really bad externalities that it's taken us all a long time to figure out, and we still don't know what to do about them as a planet. I wanted to ask the panel what they think the externalities of semiconductor ubiquity might be. Like, what problem from the ubiquitous installation of chips in everything? Jimmy wants chips in our toasters. What negative externality might that create? Not really to do with US, China, but I thought it'd be a nice one to bookend. Neil, why don't you start us off?
Just super quickly, one possible negative externality is more vectors for cyber espionage and cyber attacks. Yeah,
it's definitely one. John?
I think, I agree with Neil. The cyber, the security issue will become, not quite Skynet, but it will get close to that.
Well, that would make my life as a reporter very interesting, but I won't go as far as to hope for it. And Jimmy, what's the negative externality of your industry association's work?
I mean, I think there's one thing that we haven't done enough of. It's investing in our people and research development, and industry needs to work harder with government to try and advance the science. I mean, I'm a true believer that this industry and the digital economy has lifted all boats for people around the world. If you look at farmers in Africa using mobile phones to help their crops be more efficient, I think it's just a no-brainer in terms of the good that's brought to the world from this technology. So we need to do more to advance it. We need to invest more in universities, grow the workforce, and we can always do more in that regard.
Okay. Well, look, Jimmy, John, Neil, thank you very much. We've just hit our 3 o'clock London time deadline. Thanks also to all the questions. There's some really good ones in there. And I don't know if Paul's going to pop back up and magic us away, but thank you all very much for tuning in, and I hope you learned as much as I did.